Alright guys, welcome back to another video. We are into the Cold War era in the Americas. So chapter 21, and in this video lecture we'll look at both the United States in the couple decades right after World War II, and also Latin America immediately after World War II. There'll be a little bit of overlap with your U.S. history course, so just get ready. We won't be getting into super detail, but you will see this material again, looking at the 1950s and 60s in the United States and what was going on there. I love this era in U.S. history. I would say if I have a specialty, it's probably U.S. history through the New Deal up until kind of through Vietnam. So I love teaching it, and as a result, we'll kind of really dig in here, maybe more so than maybe some of your other teachers will do in this content. So we start off with a picture here of homeboy on his John Deere riding mower. Of course, this is the quintessential 1950s, the realization of the American dream and all of that stuff. And this is represented by this idyllic lifestyle that for some is true in the 1950s. That this consumer culture driven by access to cheap inexpensive but high quality goods, the affordability of houses, leisure time, right? A beautifully manicured home, really good neighbors that are also clean, have really awesome houses, not huge houses, but well-kept houses. This is going to be the realization of the American dream, the golden age of the American economy. And we'll start off by saying that this is mostly true. Beginning in the 1940s, the U.S. and Canada will have 3 decades of rapid economic growth and prosperity. Okay, the Great Depression is over, and we're going to basically label this a post-war boom in American history that's not going to basically turn over into the early 1970s. We'll talk about why in a minute. We do want to say, though, that this isn't just an economic boom for the America. We'll see this in Europe to some extent as well. And this economic boom in America, this is for white America. Notice how homeboy on his mower is a white dude, right? This is white suburban America that is experiencing this boom. Black America is left out of a lot of this economic restructuring. There are some gains that are made, but really the fight for Black America and much of minority America is just for equal rights. Latin America, we will not see an economic boom in these areas. There'll be demands for new economic and political rights. There'll be calls for revolution by Marxists, communists, who are going to be inspired by the Cuban and Chinese revolutions in 49 and 59, respectively. We've not talked a lot about the Chinese revolution right now so far, but we will, and we'll talk about the Cuban one even more so. We have mentioned that coincided with the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. U.S. multinational corporations will continue to head up Latin American economies. The institutionalization of economic imperialism in the United States will continue over and over, right? We'll see wealth gaps continue to increase. The rich and poor will get further apart. Political unrest will get more heated, and by the early 1970s, most of Latin America will not change and will be still ruled over by military dictatorships. Okay. Anyway, we'll get to that in the second part, the second video lecture, but I did want to just highlight that that's what was going on here in Latin America during this era. All right, the economic golden age. What does it mean? Well, the economy is going to grow by 10% a year. All right. Right now, let's see. Let's look at the American economy. The American economy growth in 2017. If we take a look at what our economic growth was last year, okay, we're looking at 2.6% just in the first quarter, right, which is really quite good. And let's see if we can take a look at this more intensely. Fourth quarter is 2.6, 3.2 in the third quarter, so pretty healthy economic growth really through 2017. But notice how that's not always the case. 10% a year is very, very, very good, and that's about what we got over the last year or so. not quite as much in 2016 or 2015. We would consider that a a bull market, right? A bull market is when the economy is growing very, very strongly. So, during World War II, the economy is going to grow at 10% over and over and over again, right? So that's an incredible growth, okay? The federal government will also continue to spend along with that growth. They will hand out literally billions of dollars in war contracts. They'll guarantee profits for some war-based corporations. Specifically, a local corporation to Asheville will be Alcoa and the Tennessee Valley Authority. They had kind of an understanding that the dams that produce power would guarantee profits for the Aluminum Company of America. And what's being done with that aluminum? You guessed it, it's being made into planes and ships and all sorts of other sorts of materials that are used in the war effort. Okay, so profits are going to increase very, very dramatically for any sort of organization that has a government contract. This relationship is known, this will be a vocab word, as a military-industrial complex. Okay, it doesn't have to be just war. In other words, it's just any sort of government-industrial relationship that benefits both, right? The government spends an enormous amount of money getting a good or a service provided by a private company, and as a result, that company gains economic prosperity. Union membership will soar. Remember, the 1935 Wagner Act made it possible for unions to be a legally represented body, and they can collectively bargain now, right? So union membership will soar, and more and more labor will be demanded, not just of white people in America, but also African Americans are going to be moving north. And another vocab word you'll definitely want to know is the Great Migration, right? Movement from southern blacks to northern cities. We have an explosion of post-war spending, okay? Not just from the government, but also from the consumer sector. All right, many of the consumer goods that we see in the 1950s, whether it's appliances or TVs or even cars, that is being driven by normal middle-class Americans having an increase in wages and spending that money on consumer goods. Per capita income will double between 1945 and 1960, and that's also crazy to see that sort of reallocation of resources, so much so that your normal everyday person is making double what they made just 15 years before. It's pretty incredible. The U.S. government will also bankroll the auto and oil industries for the tune of $26 million. Congress will pass what is known as the Interstate Highway Act, in which they build close to multiple hundreds of miles, thousands of miles of roads. You can see the map right here, connecting all of the major cities in the United States with these highways, and basically opening up all of America to road travel and road transportation. Some of these bigger projects are connecting, of course, through the Rocky Mountains here. This would be Interstate 70, which actually runs, I think, slightly north of this line, if I'm correct. Anyway, all throughout America, road travel will be the rule of thumb, and this generates an enormous new industry built along highways, right? I've mentioned here it's the largest public works project in U.S. history. New industries are centered around car travel. These include things like fast food businesses and gas stations and motels and diners. All of these things are new, and they're all dependent on the car. Okay. Notice how in Europe at the time period, they are not spending as much money on automobile travel. Why? Well, they don't have the major automobile manufacturers and oil companies that the U.S. has. And so as a result, they focus more on high-speed rail travel. And so when you go to Europe now and you're like, man, this is crazy. Why doesn't the United States have the public transportation systems, the subway systems, the rail systems? It's because literally right after World War II, the U.S. government decided to pour money into the auto industry and the oil industry in order to prop those areas up. And as a result, we have a uniquely car-centered culture in the United States. Other legislation passed during this time period is the GI Bill, and the GI Bill had to do with returning soldiers, and this guaranteed that war veterans could get education at a free or reduced rate, as well as low interest mortgages through the Federal Housing Administration, enabling them to get college degrees and homes, right? Those are the two major markers of middle class health, really in any economy. Is your populace educated with a college degree, right? Which would be actually really kind of new at this point. And can they afford a house, right? Which is generally an appreciable asset that only grows more and more and more. It's very expensive, right? So owning a house and having an education will always be kind of these blue chip markers of how well your economy is doing. As a result of this education and home buying, we're going to see a baby boom and explosion in the populations that'll really run from 1945 to 65, peaking in 1957. Maybe some of your parents are late baby boomers. Mine is an early one. My dad was born in 45, my mom was born in 49. And these baby boomers are going to grow up in a relatively privileged existence throughout the 1950s and 60s. They'll move to new areas of the country known as the Sun Belt. Some of these towns include Phoenix, LA, Houston, Miami. Other smaller, basically any town in Florida is going to be a Sun Belt area. Maybe I can actually get a map here as I talk over it. Cities that are not part of the Sun Belt are going to be, like Chicago. Here's a great picture right here. Here's the Sun Belt, southern part, right? Chicago, Minneapolis, New York, Washington, D.C. They're all older cities, right? Industrialized cities of the north, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, right? The Sun Belt will be kind of the fastest growing area, and still kind of is, especially the American Southeast, where Americans will be moving today. All right, and this is all, of course, fueled by the ability to have air conditioning, right? Now you can move to Phoenix and you can stomach a 110-degree summer because you have AC that can be pumped into houses, right? So that's going to continue. California will become the biggest state in the United States by the 1960s. Okay, so it'll surpass New York, and it's continued to surpass it more and more and more. Suburbs grow enormously throughout the 1950s and 60s. Why? 4 reasons: rising wages, affordable cars, very cheap gas, and taxpayer-funded highways, which of course we see enabled through the Interstate Highway Act, right? That's what enabled these highways to be built. Suburbs aren't really good for the environment, as you can maybe imagine. We've seen pictures before, of Levittown, for instance. Here's Levittown. I'll get another picture of this. The main idea, and this is even true today, is that here we go. Here's some great pictures of Levittown, right? See how they clear-cut trees, houses are packed in, no real green space to speak of. They pave up large portions of this area. So suburbs aren't really a good idea. It's kind of unsustainable types of building that sprawls and sprawls and sprawls. And so as a result, millions of acres of farmland and woodland is basically buried under houses and strip malls and schools or whatever else. Wetlands are drained, ecosystems are disrupted, and we see contaminants in our skies, lakes, and river, right? So suburbs aren't necessarily healthy, but this is the place you can go to get cheap land, right? And as a result of this cheap land, you can build a house, you can afford a house, and you can live more or less this American dream. Also in America, we mentioned this before, we get what is known as the Second Red Scare, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. And basically what he did is he kind of created this witch hunt of sorts, where he said that certain industries, like the film industry, is full of communists. And there was an actual governmental body formed, the House Un-American Activities Committee, that investigated these claims that certain Americans were communist spies. And McCarthy said that he could actually name, dozens of communists inside of the actual U.S. State Department. Of course, that ended up not being true, and he kept on revising that number down. But he is able to prey on the fears of Americans to increase his political power. And this is not just true of McCarthy, but any other kind of hard we call these kind of hardliners when it has to do with the Cold War. They're able to prop themselves up using fear mongering, against supposed communists. America never had a major, communist threat in our country. We did certainly have communists. We had communist spies. Some of them were in the government, but it wasn't a major threat at any point. We're also going to see increases in civil rights actions. Here we have a picture of a Woolworth sit-in, which we'll talk about a little bit later. African Americans would come into Woolworth and sit in white areas and, of course, be harassed, getting food dumped on them, and all sorts of other terrible things. The civil rights saga starts with FDR when he issued Executive Order 8802, guaranteeing equal employment opportunities for African Americans in firms and government contracts. Let's get a year for that because I didn't put it there. Executive Order 8802. This is going to be kind of well back, 1941. There it is. So a lot maybe sooner than you might think it would happen. 1941. Any business that is spending government money, or taxpayers are spending government money to provide them a contract, have to employ African Americans as well as whites. 1947, Truman will actually do a study and get a committee on civil rights, and this is a direct quote from your book saying that blacks remained, quote, second-class citizens in every sphere of life, and charges the federal government with guaranteeing equal civil rights for all. And this really, we wouldn't necessarily say that no progress is made since 1947, but this, similar studies done today show that the American black populace is still not quite out of this second-class citizen status. Not a ton has changed over the last 70 years, which is why we're starting to see more and more movements like the Black Lives Matter movement gaining steam. The first major stab, though, at integrating the United States and calling for equal rights between blacks and whites is this Brown versus Board of Education case. 1954, the Supreme Court overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson court case and got rid of the doctrine of separate but equal. This specifically applied to schools, and we could see it in schools that certain high schools were not equal, and in fact separate made two institutions inherently unequal. In a way, this basically said that it reinstated the 14th Amendment. I'll get the exact phrasing for this again, but it basically said that you cannot have separate institutions, right, or any discrimination, either life, liberty, or property, without due process of law, or deny any person within a jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So this was basically applied to the states and to the national government, saying if you have separate facilities, you're depriving certain people of their life, liberty, or property in a way, right? So anyway, the 14th Amendment is reinstated here, and this whole doctrine of separate but equal will be over. Now, it does take a while to get actually implemented, even though we have the ruling in the Supreme Court. What immediately followed the Brown versus Board of Education case was Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat in 1955 to a white rider on a Montgomery bus. It led to a 381-day boycott of the Montgomery bus system and a mass civil rights movement in the South, led by Martin Luther King Jr. Right? He is going to shoot into prominence as a civil rights leader. He founds the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, when he is 26 years old and starts organizing grassroots civil rights resistance. A few years later, John F. Kennedy will be elected in 1960. We've already mentioned kind of his role with the Cold War, but he will also inherit, a messy civil rights atmosphere. He's sympathetic to civil rights, but he's not going to come in necessarily, ready to change everything about American culture and give blacks, federally, federal legislation increasing their status. He needs to appease a group of people known as Dixiecrats or Democrats from the South. And as a result, he doesn't, really enforce this Brown versus Board of Education decision. He kind of waits and bides his time. Of course, he's going to be shot in 1963, and we'll wait for his successor to actually see movement from a federal legislative standpoint. African Americans will get more and more restless. We have the March on Washington in 1963. This is where MLK delivers his "I Have a Dream" speech. JFK is assassinated, and new President Lyndon B. Johnson will eventually pass two pieces of legislation. The first is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which banned discrimination in public spheres, not just based on race, but also age, religion, and national origin, right? I don't know why this is color, it should say gender. Also, we have the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which suspended literacy and poll taxes, and it's going to, at least in theory, re-enfranchise or allow blacks in the South to vote once again. Okay. Anyway, despite these gains, though, civil rights equality is not moving very quickly. As we move through the 60s and 70s, we have certain militant black groups like the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam, headed up by Malcolm X, that'll focus on violent means if necessary to promote equal rights between whites and blacks. We're going to get a bunch of race riots later in the 1960s. Malcolm X is quoted as saying that he doesn't see an American dream, he sees an American nightmare. He is also assassinated in 1965, but his message is going to be very different than MLK, who uses peaceful approaches to increase the rights of blacks in America. Malcolm X will advocate separation of violence if necessary. Now, Lyndon Johnson won't just preside over changes in civil rights legislation. He also is going to initiate a new program known as the Great Society and declare a war on poverty. And this is an extension of the New Deal. And by that we mean increased government involvement in culture and the everyday lives of Americans. If it means, passing social justice legislation or spending government money to make that a reality. And what he does is he creates the Medicare, Medicaid, VISTA, Head Start, and Food Stamp program and extends it to 50 million poor Americans. And it works, actually. It gets Americans out of poverty. Poverty dips from 22% to 13% in the 1960s, right? And that's an incredibly low number. 13% is an incredibly low poverty number. Once again, this isn't necessarily extending completely into the African American community. They're facing problems in employment and housing. There's police brutality, a racist criminal justice system that seems to be stacked against equal justice for whites and blacks. And rioting, of course, will occur in many cities across the United States, including Los Angeles and Harlem. Other social groups emerge during this time. Feminism, of course, will gain steam. A very vocal feminist structure will gain steam, led by an organization known as NOW. They seek to get federal bans against employment and credit bias, or money borrowing bias, and they want full legal equality. They criticize gender and sex roles that are traditional, so they criticize this world of 1950s America as being an illusion, right? And that maybe not all women need to stay at home and take care of the family and manage the house. Maybe that's not what everybody needs. And they kind of rage against stereotypes that seem to be mass marketed to Americans, and really you would be kind of seen as a weirdo if you didn't necessarily go along with those types of stereotypes. Other areas that increase women's rights, so there's a Roe versus Wade decision in 1973. This extended privacy rights to include abortion. And this creates the pro-life versus pro-choice split in America that is still present today. And what we have with these changes in the late 1960s is a group known as the New Left. And this is kind of the social left that we see today. Okay, part of the Democratic-Republican split today isn't just over the role of government economically or even with political power, but over social institutions, so like abortion and homosexual rights and all those sort of things, right? Race rights. So we start to see the New Left coming to the forefront here in the late 1960s, led by students. And they, of course, focused on the poor, criticizing the Vietnam War, and also promoting civil rights. Okay, many times they linked with the countercultural movement or the hippie movement that glorified drug use and rock music and casual sex. We see a back to nature movement, an emphasis on leisure time versus working all the time, and also communal ideas versus individual responsibility. Many, of these groups will push for more protection for environmental landscapes. We get the Wilderness Act that is passed in the late 1960s. The Sierra Club is not formed but gains major power during this time period, and many other environmental organizations as well, hell-bent on protecting landscapes like this one in Bryce Canyon. This one ends up being buried, by the way, by a dam, and it's lost forever, right? But they're seeking to protect as much land as possible and to be kind of back out in this nature, American nature, that is part of our American identity. We also have the founding of Earth Day. Environmentalists banned DDT and other chemical pollutants, passed measures for cleaner air and water. And this is, it's not, I don't want you just to think this is just a Democratic idea. The Republican presidents, Nixon, for instance, the EPA was created underneath him. So this is mainstream, right? Environmentalism is mainstreamed in the 60s and 70s, and really only recently has been kind of a partisan issue. Like I mentioned, the EPA will be created to get rid of emissions from autos and industries, and also protect endangered species. Okay. There is white backlash to civil rights reforms. I know this is kind of out of order. We'll start to see certain white supremacy groups like the WWII defend racial segregation. School integration will be very slow. Neighborhoods and workplaces even slower, and we can even see neighborhoods today that are completely unintegrated, right? The silent majority is going to increase, and these were conservatives that would hold more traditional race and gender values that don't necessarily feel free to speak it out loud for fear of being criticized by mass media. Okay, and we'll have a pull, kind of beginning in the mid-1970s, away from reform. Okay, and away from the progress that is made through the civil rights eras of the 60s and 70s. This post-war era this boom era is going to end in between 72 and 74. And there's lots of reasons why. Real wages reach their peak here, and they're going to decline afterwards. Budget deficits increase. Debt, therefore, increases. Trade deficits increase. And then unemployment and inflation will also increase. Finally, the oil shock, which OPEC, the oil-producing economies of the Middle East, will restrict production. And even though we don't get all of our oil from the Middle East, it drives up oil prices, which will cause a recession in 1973 and 1974, which we really haven't been able to recover in terms of actual wage increases that we see throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. All right, that's it for part one. We'll come back in a couple of days and go over Latin America. Good luck with your questions.